Hello all, welcome to the Solocast of Firecode Tech. In these episodes, it's just going to be me, your host, Gus Gagliardi. There's going to be a range of topics, but I'm going to talk about specific technologies, installation standards, codes and how they work, as well as some other interesting topics that don't neatly fit inside of the context of a normal interview. Hello all. On this episode of Firecode Tech, we're talking about life safety analysis. Welcome to episode 21 of Firecode Tech, the Solocast series. So, life safety is an interesting topic, and I've not found too many really good, succinct webinars or articles online discussing how to go through the motions of performing a life safety analysis. So this is something that I would have really wanted when I first got into the industry. So I want to try to take this huge task and boil it down as much as I can so that those who are just getting into the process or maybe trying to refine their process for performing a life safety analysis will be able to have some value and get some takeaways from this discussion. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode and follow us on social media so you can see all the great fire and life safety topics we're posting about. So let's get into the episode. So again, we're talking about life safety. So I want to preface with some caveats about our discussion. First and foremost, you have to understand the applicability of the codes and standards you're working in. I'm sure I sound like a broken record on this topic, but I don't want somebody to catch one of these solo casts or just tune in for a certain part of these episodes and not understand the sequence of operations for how to specify and or navigate codes and standards. So all this to say, you need to know which codes and standards are applicable for the jurisdiction you're doing work in. It's different for every state in the U.S. It's different for many cities. If you want some more information about this subject, you can take a listen to the episode we did over the International Building Code or the episode we did over codes and standards. Both of these would be a great preface for this discussion. Just wanted to place that little bullet point as an understanding of our discussion for the rest of this episode. That's episode 15 for International Building Code and episode number 2 for the Solocast on codes and standards. So we'll put some links down in the show notes, but those are some good solocasts to listen to in addition to this episode if you are looking to continue your journey on the subject of how to navigate codes and standards effectively. So in this episode, I want to give a bit of a framework for doing a life safety analysis for a building. For the purposes of this episode, let's say that it is a new construction building using the International Building Code. Specifically, I'm using the 2015 version of the International Building Code. And I want to give some concrete steps, and if you are so inclined, you could make a bit of a checklist about these steps in order to cover the analysis and feel confident in your ability to produce an analysis for a building. So this is something that I didn't have, being from a organization that had the architects do more of the life safety analysis. This wasn't in the purview of the fire protection engineering discipline, but I've learned over time how to go through these steps and really look at the most critical factors in regards to life safety in a building over time through my career as a fire protection engineer. So we've talked about this idea before, but the building code progresses from really general issues like definitions and scope in the first couple chapters. And then as it moves on, you can kind of use the progression of the chapters. 3, 4, 5, 6 is what we're going to be speaking about in this episode of a go-by for looking at the building's fire and life safety systems. This is my piece of advice: is use the structure of the building code and kind of work your way through the different chapters and the salient points. And the most formative chapters of the building code for fire and life safety, there's a lot of pertinent ones for the discipline, but 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10 are probably the biggest as it regards to fire and life safety systems. So if you can take a look at each of those chapters and see how they apply to your building, this will give you a good starting place for making sure that you're in compliance. So let's talk about a couple of these chapters in specific. Chapter 3 of the International Building Code is titled Use and Occupancy. We've talked about this chapter before, but this chapter works much in the same way that the hazard determination works in NFPA 13. There are some broad categories with levels of fire severity and combustible loading implied, and you use these chapters in combination with the engineering judgment or the design professional judgment in order to categorize different spaces of the building. And so I want to look at Section 302 in Chapter 3 as a bit of a talking point for Chapter 3. So Section 302, more specifically 302.1 general, states, structures or portions of structures shall be classified with respect to occupancy in one or more of the groups listed in this section. So as a bit of explanation point on this first statement, buildings usually have multiple occupancy classifications. So if you have a business building, you'll have portions of the building that are business. You might have a janitor's closet or a storage room that might be a storage occupancy. And so most buildings are amalgamations or combinations of different occupancy groups. So when you are looking at a building, if you're using a design software and you want to get a graphical representation of occupancy classification, commonly you will see that architects or fire protection engineers will use hatch patterns to diagram which part of the buildings pertains to which occupancies. So this is a great way for you to get an idea of the square footage of the building that is a certain occupancy, which we'll talk about is an important part of this exercise, and it'll let you just get a sense of what is the predominant occupancy and hazard. Moving on in section 302.1, the section says a room or space that is intended to be occupied at different times for different purposes shall comply with all of the requirements that are applicable to each of the purposes for which the room or space will be occupied. The best example I can think of this statement would be a business building that would have partitions, separatable partitions, so you could use a space more for an assembly use. So you might have to design for the assembly use case and the business use case. I'm sure there are other factory and industrial implications for this statement, but wanted to give a quick example. Furthermore, it says structures with multiple occupancies or uses shall comply with Section 508. Section 508 is mixed use occupancies, where a structure is proposed for a purpose that is not specifically provided for this code. Such structure shall be classified in the group that the occupancy most nearly resembles, according to the fire safety and relative hazards involved. So this is that thing that I was speaking about before. There's the engineering discretion or the design discretion to fit occupancies into the category in which they most nearly resemble. So if you get a special situation or an occupancy that is not called out, Chapter 3 gives some common examples of these occupancies in the different groups. So let's run through the groups real quick. Assembly, which there is A1 through A5. So there are a variety of different assembly groups. One example of an assembly group is like a basketball stadium, and another example of an assembly group is like a theater. So there's a wide variety within assembly. Business is kind of a catch-all for commercial occupancies or kind of office buildings, or it's a pretty wide one. Educational use, that one's pretty self-explanatory. Schools, factory and industrial. So these are F1 and F2 occupancies. Factory occupancies are a lot like storage occupancies in that there are two groups, low hazard factory and low hazard storage, and moderate hazard factory and moderate hazard storage. So high hazard group, H1 through H5, we talked about high hazard in our hazardous materials episodes. You can check those out. We have great interview episodes and also Solocast episodes about hazardous materials. Institutional occupancies, which are places where there are people who are detained or unable to care for themselves. So these are jails, these are assisted living, occupancies like that. So as you can tell, there are some inherent fire safety challenges and combustible loadings and risk baked into how you use the building and what the occupancy is. So that's why they're grouped in this way, in order to define the hazards and implications of the building. Residential is another occupancy type. This ranges from the house that you could live in to apartments and duplexes. So there are four residential occupancy groups. And then we already talked about storage and utility, which is a U occupancy, which is kind of like the dustbin for occupancy classifications. Think about a storage shed is a U occupancy. So let's move on from occupancy classification and talk about Chapter 4, which is special occupancy requirements. So special occupancy requirements, you can think about these as specific building types or occupancies which have greater implications for fire and life safety. So I wrote down some of the most common examples of these, and I just want to go over them briefly and what that could mean for your life safety analysis. 402 is covered mall and open mall buildings. So a mall is a unique kind of structure. It's different stores, different tenants, kind of a wide variety of uses for these tenant spaces. So there's a greater life safety implication here because of the added amount of people and the different uses for these spaces. Section 403 is high rises. As you can imagine, Section 403 is high rises. Section 405 is deep underground buildings. Any time where you put people in a situation which it will make it harder for them to escape a building or be close to safety or egressing, you will have additional life safety implications. So high rises come with emergency power requirements, fire pump requirements, smoke control and stairwell pressurization requirements. Section 404 is atriums. Atrium is a portion of the building that has more than 2 connecting floors. In this situation, you will need a smoke control system, which a smoke control system is a integrated system between the HVAC units and the fire alarm system in order to create a tenable space for the occupants to evacuate. These are extremely costly and very complicated, so you need to be aware when providing analysis. The whole reason why we're talking about Chapter 4 is because there are huge cost items in these specific special occupancy requirements. So you need to understand when these are applicable. And when you are looking at them and you're looking at a building, you need to know what the use and function is going to be, because it could dramatically change the level of fire and life safety that you need to provide. It could extremely change your exit requirements or your systems required. You could go from not having a pump or a tank to needing one, and that could be on the scale of hundreds of thousands of dollars, but also could be millions of dollars if you are looking at occupancy like an aircraft hangar. Let's move on to Chapter 5, which is allowable heights and areas. In order to talk about how tall and how much square footage your building can have, you have to understand construction type. Construction type is what kind of materials and what fire resistance rating is your building. I can speak for, it's interesting talking to people in the global community in fire and life safety, because building materials and the availability of building materials changes with a global perspective. So in the US, where you get a variety of wood frame construction and steel and metal buildings, as well as concrete and kind of everything in between. But you might look at somewhere like Canada, where wood and heavy timber construction is more prevalent because of local sourcing. So there are 5 types of construction, type 1 through 5. Really, we're talking about Chapter 6 stuff right now, but this plays heavily into how tall and how much square footage your building is allowed to have. So another big implication for fire and life safety and how tall and how much square footage your building can have is if the building is sprinklered or not. There are tables in Chapter 5 which dictate, based on your fully sprinklered application or your building type, how big your building can be. So Type 1 is described in Section 602.2 as Type 1 and 2. Type 1 and 2 construction are those constructions with building elements listed in Table 601 are of non-combustible materials except as permitted in Section 603 and elsewhere in this code. So Type 1 construction is completely non-combustible. And Type 2 construction, which is in the States, is extremely common for commercial building, is mostly non-combustible with some combustible materials. So these definitions are a little bit vague, and it's kind of an area that's a little bit more difficult for FPEs, or at least in my experience, because the architect is the one specifying and constructing the building type. So usually you have to work closely with the architect to determine exactly what construction type they are working with. Type 3 is defined as the type of construction in which the exterior walls are non-combustible materials and the interior building elements are of any material permitted by this code, fire retardant treated wood framing, complying with section 2303.2 shall be permitted with exterior wall assemblies of a 2-hour rating or less. So I don't have much experience with type 3 construction or type 4. They are not super common in which the occupancies that I work in or at the firm that I work in. Type 4 is heavy timber. Like I said, this is a lot of, it's heavily based on the occupancies you work in and the region of the world that you work in. So it varies greatly. But Type 5 construction is seen in many residential applications. For example, the walls and roofs are made of combustible materials, most commonly just wood frame construction, wood packages. So this is common in the U.S., but in other parts of the world, wood construction is not as common. So the lion's share of the work that I've done has been either Type 5 or Type 1 or 2. Type 1 construction type is for high-rise buildings. You have to use Type 1, and so that's basically almost zero combustible furnishings or parts of construction in the entire building, which is very costly. So you have to be aware of what construction type you're using because the building allowances between Type 1 and Type 5 are huge. You could have a couple thousand square foot building or an unlimited size building. So depending on the construction type. Well, I think that's quite enough for one episode. Hope it wasn't too broad. I wanted to kind of talk about some of the factors pertaining to life safety and progressing through the chapters and looking at some of the common elements. We can talk about more on how to analyze for life safety, but really I just wanted to state, hey, here are the chapters in which you want to look at. You want to go through these chapters and kind of categorize all of these different elements of a building. So generate a list of the salient life safety factors. So you have a business building that's type 2B construction, and it has incidental or accessory uses in the form of storage occupancies, and start to build a list. And you don't have any special use occupancies in your business building, so you can take a look at your allowable height and area, and kind of build a list of the different fire and life safety factors. You do have sprinklers, but you don't have a standpipe system because your building's not over 35 feet. So really what a life safety analysis looks like is addressing all the important factors for fire and life safety, kind of tabulating them and making sure that you are providing the code minimum requirements and making sure that is also in line with the building owner's need for their function. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time on Fire Code Tech. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.